Today I will be teaching Korea's interaction with the Western powers and unequal treaties with Japan. To any Koreans in the early 19th century, their society was to undergo relentless series of upheavals and radical transformation. There was a 12th century old kingdom with a social and political system that had evolved but not drastically changed in more than a million times. Korean leaders and elites were confident in the virtuousness of their state and society, considering it a bastion of truly civilized values, the most faithful, ardent of correct ethical norms derived from Chinese Confucian tradition. Early contacts with the West. The world Koreans inhabited was dominated by China, the vast continental empire that contained one of the world's wealthiest, oldest, and most sophisticated societies. Then there was Japan to the east, a participant in the broader East Asian cultural world, but also a warlike and dangerous society. To the northwest were the semi nomadic people that had so often invaded Koreans, maintained sporadic contacts with Vietnam's Siamese, and other Southeast Asian people. Beyond this was the world of distant barbarians that Koreans had little contacts. Among these were the remote peoples were the Europeans. Early in the 16th century, reports of the presence of Fulangi in the Southeast Asia reached Korea, and in 1597 a Jesuit Gregorio de Caspides arrived in Korea accompanying the Japanese troops. Some Korean captives in Hideyoshi invasions were brought back to Japan and converted to Christianity. Direct contact with the West came in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Jesuits, under the talented polymath Matteo Ricci, established a small mission in Beijing at the end of the 16th century, while they made few converts. The Chinese emperors employed Jesuits to help them to maintain an accurate calendar. Koreans traveling in diplomatic mission encountered these Jesuits and shared the Chinese administration for their technical and mathematical skill. A number of other scholars and officials on diplomatic missions met Jesuits and picked up some knowledge of Western science and religion. One of these, Kong Tu Wong, in 1631, brought back with him a telescope, a clock, a Western gun, maps of the world and heavens, and books in Chinese by Western missionaries on astronomy and the world geography. For the most part, Koreans were dismissive of Christianity. In the 18th century, Korean visitors to China continued to stop by Jesuits' mission, became part of the standard tour of exotic sites in the imperial capital. Jesuits even complained about the Korean visitor who handled their musical instrument and wandered around the cathedral in Beijing. Some Koreans were impressed by the Western painting, especially its mastery of linear perspective. Few Koreans seemed to take the Europeans very seriously as bearers of great tradition. Koreans, through their diplomatic missions in China, were aware of more disturbing events. The British went to war with China from 1839 to 1842 in what is known as the Opium War, in which they defeated the Chinese and forced them to open ports to trade on British terms. Britain and France went to war with China again from 1858 to 1860, inflicting another defeat and extracting more concession. The Opium War could be dismissed as merely a successful pirate attack by the barbarians. But the capture and pillage of Beijing in 1860 by an Anglo-French force was a truly alarming development. Koreans, through their diplomatic missions in Beijing, kept informed of these events. During 1864-1865, a number of Russians came to the border town of Yongting, insisting on trade, while in 1863, Koreans living in the northwest began to migrate across the border into the Russian territory. To the east, the United States forced Japan to open itself to trade with the West in 1854. To the east, Japan posed another threat to Korea. Japan underwent a sweeping changes with the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate and the creation of the newly formed, reformed-minded Meiji government in 1868. In January 1869, an envoy from Japanese island of Tsushima arrived at Busan to announce the new government. The Korean officials refused to receive letters. They were offended by the idea of an imperial restoration. Koreans have never recognized the Japanese ruler as emperor, since that would place him on the basis of equality with the Chinese emperor. Although the Japanese leadership decided not to invade Korea, they were determined to open diplomatic relations with their neighbors. In May 1875, they sent the warship to Busan, joined 2 weeks later by inviting the Koreans abroad and by firing their guns in demonstration. And other ships then sailed along the coast of Korea, serving the waters. When they entered the prohibited areas, Kangwa Island, they were fired upon by shore batteries. The warship returned fire, destroying the Korean guns. Japanese troops then overran a small fort on the island of Incheon, killing and wounding a number of defenders. Other warships were dispatched to Busan with the excuse of protecting the Japanese resident there. In February 1876, Kurando Kiyotaka landed on Kangwa Island with a substantial military force and demanded an apology for what he claimed was an unprovoked attack on Japan's ship. Japan wanted more than an apology. It insisted Korea open diplomatic and trade relations with its new government. Korean court was now in crisis. In December 1873, Tang Wangan had been forced to resign, and the young king Kojong took personal control. Shortly after assuming power, Kojong faced this serious challenge. Most officials opposed recognition, but some, such as Pak Yong-soo, the same official who had ordered the destruction of the general Sherman, argued for negotiation, as did the Chinese government. Kong-jong supported the latter view, and in February 1876, this government signed the Treaty of Kangwa. The Treaty of Kangwa was very important in the history of Korea and Asia. In the treaty, Korea recognized new administration in Tokyo and agreed to open Busan and some other ports within 20 months to the Japanese. The 12th article of the treaty had profound implications that few Koreans at the time probably understood. Korea was recognized as an independent state, posing the same sovereign rights as Japan. This contradicted the traditional view of Korea as a Chinese tributary state. The concept of an international community of equal and sovereign nation was alien to the East Asian order as Koreans had always interpreted it. The other articles permitted the Japanese to survey Korean waters, allowed Japanese to reside in treaty ports, and gave the Japanese the right of extraterritorial, that is, Japanese in Korea, would be subject to Japanese law and courts. In accordance with Article 11 of the treaty, a further agreement on the treaty was signed a few months later that had given additional economic privilege to the Japanese. The Treaty of Kangwa proved a turning point in the Korean history. It ended its isolation, undermined the tributary system that had framed Korean foreign relations for centuries, began the Japanese penetration into Korea that would eventually undermine the economic and political order, and it brought Korea into the imperialist rivalries of the late 19th century. Korea's vigorous effort to insulate itself from the changing world around it came to an end. It is not likely, however, that many Koreans in 1876 were aware of just how momentous a step they had taken. From July 1894 to February 1896, Korean reformers under the sponsorship of Japanese enacted a sweeping series of laws and regulations that marked a sharp break in the country's historical tradition. Although these efforts by some of the most talented and progressive of Korean leaders were of great importance in bringing about necessary steps towards modernization, the fact that they were carried out under Japanese military pressure and heavy-handedness of Japanese interference left an ambiguous legacy. When the Japanese troops occupied the palace, the king became a virtual prisoner under the direction of the Japanese minister. New government was placed in charge. In late July 1894, Japanese directed reforms created a deliberative council with 17 and later 23 members. Until it was abolished in December, it was the principal organ for carrying out the sweeping restructuring of government and society. The new government was staffed by the leading reformers of the country. To appease conservatives and the Tonghak, the Japanese installed the again Tuangan as the nominal head of the new government. He was also few of the pro-Chinese Minnan. Important conservative officials were appointed to a largely powerless Privy Council. The State Council was replaced by a cabinet-style organization with a prime minister. New ministries were created to deal with foreign affairs, home affairs, finance, justice, education, defense, agriculture, commerce and industry. Much of the authority of the king was removed to a new cabinet and to a prime minister. The affairs of the court were separated from the rest of the government and administered by the Department of Royal Household Affairs. The government was rationalized with a clear separation of judiciary and military functions from civil ones. It enacted laws that established a separate hierarchy of courts and issued decrees outlawing the torture of suspects, guilt by the association, and punishment of the family members of the criminal. The government created a new capital and provincial police system and made plans of rationalization of the tax system as well. It abolished arbitrary taxes and merchant monopolies. A series of measures brought about significant social reform. An official 1886 ban on the sale of slaves was confirmed. Now, 31 years after United States had done so, the government legally abolished slavery in all forms. The new administration officially eliminated social distinction of all sorts. Therefore, it seems that a number of reforms were taking place. It increased the marriage age for men and women to 20 and 16 respectively, outlawing child marriage. A long legal prohibition against widow remarriage ended. It relaxed stamp duty laws that had emphasized social restrictions or distinction. One of the most momentous action by the council was its abolition of civil service examination that had been centered to recruiting officials and confirming elite status. To signal a break off with the old Chinese tributary system, it proclaimed in June 6 the Korean Independence Day. It used the Korean alphabet in government documents and degrees that Korean history was taught in school. The old Ming Chinese calendar was replaced with the Western ones. A new Ministry of Education promulgated a series of ordinances creating a Western style of education system. The Hong Kong Normal School was established along with 5 primary schools in the capital, with plans to establish others throughout the country. The ministry created a new modern curriculum and compiled books for it. The whole program is known as the Keibo Reform. The Deliberate Council issued over 200 reform bills in total. In December, Japan sent a leading political figure in Keiron to supervise the reform efforts. To eliminate threats to the new government, he removed the Kwangwan-gun, who had been secretly plotting with Chinese, seeking to dethrone his son Kojong, who was now cooperating with the Japanese. So therefore, a number of confusions were taking place. Japan's victory over China only strengthened its prestige, aiding those Koreans who wanted to use the Meiji reform as a model. It now seemed inevitable that Japan would be Korea's big brother. But all this changed rather suddenly with the diplomatic setback that almost immediately followed the Treaty of Shimonoseki. In the Treaty of April 7, 1895, China agreed to lease Liaodong Peninsula with its potential naval base at Port Arthur to Japan. This alarmed Russia, which had its own designs on Port Arthur as a possible warm water port in the region. Russia quickly gained the support of France and Germany to issue a joint demand by the 3 powers that Japan cancel the lease. Facing what was called the Triple Intervention, Japan complied. This humiliation, coming shortly after his victory, was interpreted by Koreans as evidence of Japan's weakness. Opponent of the pro-Japanese government gained courage. Min clan members forced Pang Yong-ho back into the exile in July, and Keibo reform efforts seemed threatened. A new Japanese minister, Miura Goro, arrived in September, sought to reverse the shift in power by claiming Queen Min, around whom many of the pro-Russian, anti-Japanese Korean officials rallied. Following his plans on October 8, Japanese and some Koreans collaborates broke into the palace and murdered Queen Min, 2 ladies in waiting, and a court official. Queen Min's body was burned with kerosene. This brutal act terrified people, and therefore this led to the wave of anti-Japanese feeling. It also brought international condemnation. Therefore, it seems that this sort of incident that took place shocked the entire world. All these events symbolized both the depth of the reform efforts and the degree to which the reformers had moved ahead of most ordinary Koreans. Therefore, it seems that nonetheless the Keibo reforms were a step in the transformation of the Korean society and brought on a new international environment. Despite the country's loss of independence, this period brought about important changes that marked the birth of modern Korea. Korea's entry into the world of imperialism profoundly altered the society. By the early 20th century, the forces of modernization were being felt throughout the country. To summarize, the world Koreans inhabited was dominated by China, the vast continental empire. But still, Korea had contacts with the Japanese in the east, the Vietnamese, Siamese, and the other Southeast Asian people. Beyond this was the world of distant barbarians that the Koreans had little contacts. Among these were the Europeans. Early in the 16th century, reports of the presence of Pulangi in Southeast Asia reached Korea, and in 1597, Jesuits also arrived Korea accompanying the Japanese troops. Later on, a number of reforms were also enacted in Korea, and the most important was the Kobo reform. But the country ultimately lost its independence. But though Korea lost its independence, it reached the verge of modernization, and the total society of Korea was transformed into a modern society.